More than 6 million people around the globe have been diagnosed with COVID-19. In the United States, more than 100,000 have died and 40 million people have lost their jobs. Cities and local governments have been on the front line of the response to the pandemic, and public service leaders are leading the recovery. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chris Moyer, and I am Z Prime's Senior Director of Research and Content. Today, we're doing a special report, a special Z Prime Now report on how cities and utilities are responding, recovering, and building more resilient systems. Today, we are going to focus on the recovery element of that three-part series: recovery, community, and infrastructure development. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to let you know we do want you to ask questions during the program. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner of the WebEx window to submit questions. Then we'll take some time throughout the program, and certainly at the end, to have our speakers answer as many of those as we have the time for. If at any time you're having trouble with the audio or video, refreshing WebEx or closing it out and then signing back in will most likely help. And the webinar recording will be available after the program is complete, so don't worry about missing anything. We usually get them up on our website in a day or two. You'll receive an email linking you to both the webinar playback and other interesting material related to today's conversation. Now I want to bring our two panelists into the conversation. Lara Cottingham is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Houston and a longtime public servant. Lara, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and join you guys.
Great, thank you. And Britt Harter is the Director of State and Local Government at Guidehouse, a management consultancy company that focuses on helping utilities and local governments with the changes that are happening related to the energy transition and other major topics. Britt, thank you so much for joining us. All right, so as I mentioned at the top of the program, we're in an incredibly unique time. COVID-19 has had such a profound impact on people's lives, their livelihoods, their health, and the way that we interact with one another. But COVID-19 isn't the only challenge that cities are facing. This is the momentary challenge. And this is something that I know, Lara, you deal with very directly at the Sustainability Office in Houston. I'm interested how, at a top level, how Houston has been responding to the public health and economic challenges related to COVID-19, and still thinking about those long-term challenges of transforming the city and the region to be more sustainable, more resilient, and more prepared for challenges like climate change.
So absolutely, this is an unprecedented time, right? In the city of Houston and in cities all across the world. And I think that it is really, it is challenging on so many levels, but cities have a unique role to play in the response. And in my role in the city of Houston as the Chief Sustainability Officer, working with my team in the Sustainability Office, we function as an internal consulting team within the city of Houston to try and make all of our operations more efficient, right? We want to use less energy, we want to save money, we want to also, reduce those greenhouse gas emissions because Houston is incredibly impacted by climate change. And up until a few months ago, right, climate change was one of the biggest challenges that we could possibly imagine facing our city in Houston and any city. But things have changed so much, so fast, so quickly. And that's that unique role of cities, right? We are responsible for protecting our citizens' immediate public safety. We have to deal with the challenge at hand. And so for the past couple of months, my team and everyone in the city, from the mayor all the way down, has been 100% working on COVID-19 and the response. But at the same time, we have to keep doing what we normally do and keep our eye on the next challenge, right? We have to prepare for what is at hand and prepare for the things that are coming down the pipe, right? And so that's where the city of Houston, we have been working incredibly hard to protect public safety, to open up more testing centers, to make sure that we are social distancing. And what's interesting in that we're in Houston, we're in Texas, that we fairly quickly closed things down and then fairly quickly are now opening things back up, right? So both of those present unique challenges, serious economic challenges to our community, because in addition to the COVID-19 economic impacts every city is facing, as the proud energy capital of the world, we're facing an additional level of economic stress from what's going on in the global energy industry. So my team, in the midst of all of this, worked to put forward the city's first climate action plan. And we also announced that we have moved to 100% renewable energy. Never in 1,000 years thought that this would happen during this pandemic, but it's a really good example of how cities have to juggle multiple things, and how even in the midst of this really unprecedented challenge, the themes of sustainability, of resiliency, of economic recovery, and these are all public safety components, they are still running through. And my goal and the city's goal is that we always build forward, not back, right? We have seen this happen in Houston after Hurricane Harvey, and that's kind of become our mantra. And that is going to continue to be the theme as we move forward through this challenge and all of the challenges that we will face.
That concept of building forward, not back, is something that I know we will touch on repeatedly through this conversation. Britt, I want to bring you into the talk right now. As Lara so eloquently described how Houston is responding to the challenge, both from a public health perspective, an economic perspective, and then the walking and chewing gum part of doing government. Can you give us a perspective of what's going on in cities around the country and how they are responding?
Absolutely, and thank you. And yeah, I thought Houston has done a wonderful job. So when we look across the country, what we've been seeing up until now is response phase work, fighting the pandemic, trying to keep head and heart together, keep basic services running, protect the most vulnerable people, ensure the integrity of the healthcare system. So we've been doing a lot of that and working, we've been supporting up to 30 states worth of clients through this response, working shoulder to shoulder with them, often around response coordination and also maximizing federal funds. What we're starting to see is that, as we're starting to move from response into the restore phase, where we're starting to open up our economies, come back, and it's a very careful and slow process. And so there's contact tracing, there's supporting small businesses, there's trying to bring society back in a way that we all feel safe. But that one of the other things that we're still seeing is as we start to go back, we're really seeing leading cities also think forward into recovery and also reimagining their cities, saying, okay, how can we not just go backwards, but think about what's possible going forwards, both in terms of new federal dollars making those investments possible, and also just a sense of collective action. We've been through something, and we now know we need different cities that are more connected, more sustainable, more resilient, and how can we take this opportunity to reimagine our communities to what we know they need to be to respond to both this pandemic and other ones. And we're seeing that all across the country. And in addition, we're just seeing cities and communities stay committed. We've also seen sustainability topics stay on the radar. They're not falling off. Leaders, New York, Los Angeles, all over, still marching forward with important projects around that. So it's, that stayed very top of mind as we're reimagining their communities, because those ideas go together so well.
Well, thank you. You touched on the idea of restore or respond, restore, recover, and then reimagine. And I think that's a really excellent framework for how cities, local governments, and even businesses can respond to this challenges. Businesses like utilities, and then the small and local businesses that those utilities and cities serve. Can we define some terms for the audience, though, so that we make sure we're all on the same page? When we're talking about resiliency, recovery, and even infrastructure, Britt, I want to turn to you first. How do you think about those terms? How does Guidehouse use those terms to help inform partners and that you're working with?
Absolutely, and I think this is something that we've touched on, because those are often big terms, and they're terms that are maturing and that different stakeholder groups are using differently. And so, when we talk about resilience, we think about it broadly as the ability of a community to manage any kind of shock and return as good or better. And so, what COVID has taught us is that our definition of what a shock is and which shocks we're likely to see is continuing to expand. And so, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to actually run that, but that, it's more than just preparing for the disasters that have already happened and making sure they don't happen again, but really being a strong community that can manage any shock that comes. In terms of infrastructure, also, again, I think we have a sort of 1950s definition of, things made of concrete and steel, and that's definitely important, but that we're also looking at, mobility systems, transportation pathways, forms of service, even community connectivity. What are the broadband? What are the kinds of physical materials and social and business connections that make the place run?
Lara, as the Chief Sustainability Officer, you mentioned that your office really acts as a consultant for all kinds of city departments that often deal with some of these ideas of infrastructure. How do you define these terms and as you want to build forward and not backwards?
So the terminology question is always fun here in Houston because there's lots of buzzwords and whatever is kind of the hot topic of the day. Is it resiliency? Is it climate? Is it smart cities? And the answer is those are all good things. And to me, you have to be doing all of them together, right? For a city to be successful, you have to be sustainable and resilient. And I hate it when anybody says that we need to be a smart city, because that implies that we are not already, right? But in Houston, when we talk about resilience, that takes on a little bit of a different term than in some cities, because quite frankly, we have so many challenges. In many cities, you would have one office that would work on sustainability and resilience because they go hand in hand, right? They're two sides of a coin. But in Houston, we have a sustainability office. We have a resilience office. We have a recovery office that was our Harvey recovery office. And we have now had to spin off another recovery office. So we will have one office that's specifically focused on Harvey recovery and flooding, and then a COVID recovery office. And what's interesting is that after Hurricane Harvey, and when the city was in the initial first stages of trying to figure out how do we bounce back from this enormous event, Marvin Odom, who was a former executive at Shell, came over to the city and helped lead that effort. And it was great because we really needed extra capacity and someone who had experience not only leading a multinational organization, but advocating at the federal and state levels, and who could really step in and help unite the different parts of the city in a really vulnerable time. And so flash forward to today, when we have another crisis, Marvin Odom has come back. And now he's leading our COVID recovery team. And so we have to, in some ways, break out the different pieces and components. So my office works on sustainability as it pertains to resilience, in that we want to reduce our climate risk, because climate risk is an enormous resilience issue for the city of Houston. But as COVID has shown us, climate risk is important and it's always going to be there. But there are health risks, there are economic risks, there are infrastructure risks that we have to always be working on. And as we move forward, what we are going to see, and I think we will really all learn from COVID, is that all of the different types of infrastructure are connected, and that to be truly resilient, you need to not only prepare for climate risks, but you need to be thinking about health and economic impacts, right? And that when you look at your transportation infrastructure, when you look at your energy and utility infrastructure, when you look at buildings, moving forward, those individual systems that we've always kind of compartmentalized are all starting to come together, right? And the electrification of all the things will bring a much more systematic approach to what has traditionally been siloed. And then to get that crucial resilience component, how do we overlay the potential shocks and stresses to that system, which could be from climate, it could be economic, and it could be health or security related. I mean, you really kind of have to go down a kind of dark and scary path to start thinking of all of the possible things that could happen. But being a truly resilient city means that no matter what happens, you can bounce back, and that you bounce back better, stronger, and forward, not just back to where you were.
That's such a great point, and I really also appreciated your idea regarding smart cities. No city wakes up in the morning and says, well, let's do things the dumb way. And what we believe at Z Prime, we really are trying to shift this paradigm of thinking away from the nomenclature of smart cities, which emphasizes a technology-first approach as opposed to a people-first approach. And I know that that's something both of you really value as well. And the idea is really creating that connected, resilient community that emphasizes finding solutions for people's needs, as opposed to just, here's a technology and this is the way that we are going to apply it to our citizens. Britt, as Lara talked about, there are different definitions, and there are the ability to learn lessons. Lara mentioned how Hurricane Harvey was so instrumental. This terrible disaster was so instrumental in Houston's ability to create a recovery team with the exact same individual leading the recovery team for COVID-19. What are you seeing other cities who have faced similar natural disasters or experiences do to learn from past crises and apply them to how we move forward today?
Absolutely, and I think, the concept of learning and thinking our way forward is exactly what we hope for when we think about resilient and sustainable communities. Is where can we get to? And in terms of what we see for learning, I would say there's sort of two types of learning. The first is there is obviously the very specific learning, again, about the thing that has just happened. What are the changes we need to avoid the big floods of Superstorm Sandy, the fires of last year in California? And that teaches us real and meaningful lessons about how to manage specific and present risks in places, in terms of whether it has to do with what you build or your organization, or being prepared for things that happen looking backwards. But again, I think looking forward, that's where we're really seeing the leadership in resilience. And that's in terms of leading cities. I was very impressed with Chicago's resilience plan as well, looking at things like community connectivity, distribution of services. How can we make sure that the place and the people can be the tools to survive the stress? Because that's really, I think, one of the things we're seeing in COVID as much as anything is, a city, a state, a federal government, can own things and have people and have resources, but really a lot of what is making the difference is when communities are able to look out for each other, when individuals can help each other, when they're able to have that kind of connectivity. It's a very powerful resilience driver, and it's one that we're seeing as a differentiator as well. Places that are thinking about how can we be the kinds of places where the people are healthy and safe and connected to each other, because that really drives their ability to withstand shocks, both sort of foreseeable and also not yet sort of well planned for.
I think that it's very important that your conversation, both of your conversation, has really sparked the idea that it's not that disasters aren't going to happen. The idea of recovery and resiliency and sustainability planning is not 100% to prevent a Hurricane Harvey or a Hurricane Sandy, or even to prevent COVID-19 from occurring. People will be impacted. It's how can we mitigate that impact? And Lara, as Houston continues to respond and recover from COVID-19, it is that focus on people and keeping people safe that I know is a major focus throughout Houston's government, and one that the Sustainability Office is working on. How are you trying to help keep people safe now and into the future as we respond to other challenges?
So I think it goes, I'll say two things. One is, we are dealing with the immediate health impact at hand, and that is in many ways similar to what you're seeing in every city across the country, just like day by day, hour by hour. I'm making sure that people have the PPE that they need, making sure that our health system is supported as best we can. I'm trying to put immediate programs in place so that the city can continue to function, but as safely and socially distantly as possible. And on a larger level, there's a lot of changes to our society right now that we're looking at, and how do you open back up, or how do we adapt to this new normal in a safe fashion? And an interesting thing that we're seeing here in Houston right now, Houston is a car city. If you've ever been here, or if you just Google it, right, we grew up in the highway era. We have massive highway overpasses that astonish people if you're not from here. And so our community is based on driving places. But this has given us this opportunity where people are not in their cars, and they are doing everything they possibly can to get outside and use our beautiful park space, use our bike plan. A lot of people don't know Houston has more park space than any other big city in the country. And we have a really ambitious bike plan that would have over 1,500 miles of high comfort bike lane in our city. And so, whereas before these plans have been kind of proactive, forward thinking, city planners think about where should we put infrastructure in. We now have Houstonians outside showing us exactly where they want that infrastructure. And so I think that's such a neat and unexpected silver lining that's come from all of this, is that we have new challenges that we wouldn't have had before. There's obviously a public safety component, but it's not all bad, right? There are some things that we can really learn from and hopefully advance our city. And then another thing that I would bring up that's really important in this conversation around resilience planning, around sustainability, smart cities, whatever it is that events like COVID, events like Hurricane Harvey show the importance of planning, right? That you need to do an overview of your systems and your infrastructure to try and think where you're vulnerable to whatever may come. And that the hardest time to do this type of planning is right after you've had a major event. That everyone's instinct is to go back to that place where you were safe and happy. I just want to go back to how it was 3 months ago, right? And I don't blame you. I would want that too. But cities' jobs in this planning process is to say, no, you cannot go back. I'm going to take you out of your comfort zone, but we're going to put you in a place that is hopefully stronger, more sustainable, and resilient to all of the things that come. And so that in itself is a challenge, and it is inherently a public safety issue. And it's not always a smooth road, right? There's going to be some bumps in it going forward, but every time something like this happens, and in a climate context, you see it where not every city is impacted at the same time. You really can learn from each other. You can learn from what's happened to figure out how to move forward.
We're having some great questions coming in from the audience, and I do want to say, please ask your question. We'll work this into the conversation and then take some time to answer those questions at the end of the program. But I want to pick up on a question from the audience right now. Susanna has asked about equity in response, and it is clear that the public health and economic impact of COVID-19 has disproportionately been felt by Black and Hispanic communities around the country. Cities and local governments work to build back better. How can we build a more equitable and sustainable, broad-based recovery for all citizens? And Britt, I'd really like you to take that question first.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much, Susanna, for raising that. I think that's been, I would say, one of the most painful realizations of this pandemic has been both the disproportionate impact on Hispanic and Black and marginal communities, but also the realization that many of the conditions of both transportation, pollution, job structures are all creating the stresses that are driving many of those disproportionate harms as well. And so as we look forward to thinking about how we can incorporate and deliver the kind of equity and health and safety that all of our residents deserve, I think we see it in a few places. I mean, the first is obviously that when you're looking at health-based drivers, sustainable long-term planning does begin to alleviate those. When you're looking at cleaner transportation, cleaner energy, the ability to move and be healthy, all of those are going to be powerful levers towards a long-term, better community, the one we know we need. But I think it's also important not just to say, oh, well, sustainability will make everything equitable and then everything is going to be fine. And so we need to think, in addition to those powerful benefits that, equity benefits that we can't get without sustainability, also just driving an inclusion process that listens to and thinks about all of our residents. It's something actually we're doing in Los Angeles around congestion pricing. The congestion pricing, obviously powerful tool, but reducing emissions, improving economic activity, general quality of life, but it's also got trade-offs, particularly around cost and who's going to pay and who can afford it. And we're working very closely to do a deep engagement with the communities who will be affected, particularly marginalized communities, to be able to understand, bring their voices into the process, and make sure that the sustainable future we build has everybody's perspective involved so that it can be truly equitable. I think that's still a point of where the conversation is maturing. We know we need equity. We know it matters, but we're all, and decision makers in particular are still have some room to grow there, and I hope we will all grow together.
Lara, what are some of the steps that you in Houston are taking to factor in equity as part of your sustainability planning?
So I love what Britt just said, how we would love to say that sustainability will solve all of the problems, right? And in many ways it can, but it's not that simple, because it is very easy to look at some of the solutions, especially technology systems that can be put in place, but they themselves may not be equitable, or you have to really figure out what is the component, what is the impact across your entire community. It's so simple to think everyone needs an electric vehicle and everyone needs a solar panel. Tesla can reimagine your entire life for certain parts of the community that can afford it. And you can see me in my apartment. I can't have an electric vehicle or solar panels. So how do we use the technology that's available to make sure that we get the improvements? Because the connection between pollution, between climate and COVID, and the impact on the communities is pretty clear, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can put the technology in the communities and that will solve everything, right? So you really have to figure out a way that if not every single person can participate, can every single person benefit? And the cost question here is so important because climate change, again, previously the biggest challenge any of us could possibly have imagined, had a incalculably large price tag. And the idea of how do we allocate that cost is going to be a long question we're all going to talk about. So now we've factored in another unprecedented challenge. We've got folks all across the community and the world who are out of a job or their jobs are heavily impacted. How now are we going to start solving these problems and who's going to pay? Cities themselves are heavily impacted, right? One of the questions that I saw pop up over here was about parks. And do we think parks are going to have even more of a role to play? And they are, but if their budgets are going to be cut, how do we balance those two, right? So the equity question is hugely important. It is a question I do not have all of the answers to right now. I know that it is absolutely crucial, at least in Houston, but I'm sure in cities everywhere, to get stakeholders involved, right? Because decisions are made by the people who show up. And you often have the squeaky wheel component, right? Where a certain group or interest or even just person is the only person who's talking about something. And that really influences the policy discussion. So how can we get those communities that are most impacted to use their voice and participate in the conversation? And then another thing that my team is really looking at is how do we bring in corporate partners? Because some of the challenges are too big and too expensive for the city to handle on our own. And so to be a good corporate citizen, to be a neighbor, to be sustainable and resilient and equitable, we really all need to come together and work on fixing our communities as a whole, not just say, oh, that's something the government will fix.
Great points from both you, Lara, and Britt. Charlie has asked several great questions, and just to touch on pieces of those, you had mentioned libraries. Lara had mentioned parks as an opportunity. We're going to touch on quality of life opportunities throughout this discussion, but libraries being both sustainability centers and an opportunity to bridge that digital divide that many cities face with lower income residents is not able to access some of the parts of the digital economy. And that's not specific to Black and Brown communities. However, they are often most disproportionately impacted by that digital divide. And so some of those concrete policy examples that focus on equity is work that works on reducing pollution in low income areas, work to expand opportunities for access to the internet and access to economic and educational opportunities. And I'm sure we will touch on multiple of those. But Charlie, thank you for your questions, and we will continue to try to address those throughout the program. I do want to, and everybody's questions, I do want to move on and focus a little bit more specifically on the recovery side of the equation right here. It's the end of May, and we have started another hurricane season in the United States, and NOAA has projected that there will be 4 to 6 major hurricane events that could touch down in the United States this year. Based on what you've seen with Hurricane Harvey in the past and past flooding, what steps are you and the city of Houston taking to mitigate risks that could compound some of the challenges we're already facing with COVID-19?
So, fun fact about the city of Houston is that we don't need hurricane season to flood. right? Houston has flooded famously on Tax Day, on Memorial Day twice, Halloween, 4th of July, and Hurricane Harvey and Tropical Storm Imelda last year. We have to give them names and to keep them apart in our heads because floods happen here so often. And because of climate change, you don't need a named storm. It can just be a Tuesday. And storms come up so fast and so quickly and so intensely that you see either localized flooding to the kind of city shutting down massive and very dangerous flooding. So in terms of the storm season, we use that as the kind of annual reminder for Houstonians to make sure that they are prepared, that you have your hurricane readiness kits, which are very similar to your coronavirus pandemic, right? You need to have 2 weeks of food stored up and all of these things. The city has been working very, very hard since Harvey and since the Tax Day, Memorial Day flood in terms of flood control and resilience projects all across the city to help mitigate some of the immediate flooding risks, right? There are some areas that have repeat flooding, but in today's world, there's a new level of challenge around this because, we've all probably done a good job of stocking up on food and are ready for that kind of event. But also in Houston, when we have these massive floods, you have to evacuate people out of danger, and we move them to shelters. Our football stadium, our convention center, right, can hold and sometimes have to hold thousands of people. What does that look like in a coronavirus pandemic world? And so all of these things are being thought about and worked on to make sure that you add your PPE to your hurricane preparedness plan so that you are prepared if you do have to leave your house, that you are not additionally exposed in the process, right? But that's going to be a really tough challenge no matter what, because in an emergency situation, you have to get people out of rising floodwaters. All of our first responders who are right now responding to the COVID pandemic are double training to be able to do both, right? And that's one of those neat challenges about cities, is that we are the folks whose boots on the ground and boats in the water have to respond to no matter what comes our way. So I'm fairly confident that we will be able to handle whatever happens, but we all have our fingers crossed that that all of the predictions about the additional storms this year are wrong, right? It's completely possible too. We could have a great season with no storms.
Well, I do think that we should always be optimistic, but I like that optimism can always be based on the foundation of planning and preparation, and that's really the idea that you're driving at, Laura. Britt, what in specifically to that point of planning and preparation, what steps should cities and governments be taking right now to respond to a hurricane, if they're in the Gulf or on the East Coast, or a forest fire, a fire if we're throughout the West and parts of the Midwest, or just your run-of-the-mill summer storm that knocks power out? What can cities do to help their citizens be prepared, and what should they be doing to be prepared?
Absolutely. And I think the seriousness of that challenge and the difficulty navigating it are, front and center here. How do you deal with another major shock when you're currently dealing with one? And that's always going to be tough. But unfortunately, nobody told the Gulf of Mexico that there's a pandemic, and nobody told the Santa Ana winds that there's a pandemic. And so, those, they may well happen. And I would say the things that we're looking at are a fewfold. The first is that, continuing to drive our communication and preparedness, coming back to our communities as being prepared to weather them, even if the infrastructure is still, still being sort of created or repaired. The second is obviously transitions that allow the limited physical and human resources of cities to manage multiple challenges. One of the things we're seeing, particularly in energy and the energy transformation, is the movement towards technology, AI, smart grids that allow for protective actions or reparative actions to be taken without teams of people. And so if you've only got one team of people and they're already responding to the pandemic, having the kinds of processes and approaches that allow you to do things without additional people can really prepare you well to be able to respond to multiple things at the same time. And then obviously in the long term, we're looking at the ability to both create resilient infrastructure, create the communities we need, decarbonize our energy to minimize the volatility of these challenges. And so I think there's still opportunities to think long-term about the communities that we want and make sure that we're sort of keeping that collective action going forward. But ultimately, in the short term, it comes down to the communities themselves. I mean, we've learned how to take collective action and making sure that we're leveraging that power, and then also for the cities using the tools that they've got to be able to respond to multiple things, hopefully letting technology, AI, and new transformations give them lift and help where they can.
Again, great questions coming in from the audience. Thank you so much. We've had a couple points brought up by Param and Mike, who talked about some of the tools to battle COVID-19, whether that's contact tracing, testing and contact tracing at the front end to do some of that diagnosis, and then some preventative measures from personal protective equipment, and hand sanitizer. And obviously there has been a tremendous shortage, as Mike brings up, around finding hand sanitizer. Are there steps, Britt, I'll turn this to you first. Are there some technologies and steps that you've seen cities take in regards to ramping up contact tracing and that testing component to deal with this, and we'll stop with that, and then we'll address some of those preventative measures next.
Absolutely, and so I think this is the next big question: is as we leave response, we leave fighting the pandemic, and we begin to reopen, we know we're going to need to move to a more robust contact tracing and testing regime in order to manage the level of infection. And so I think all cities are struggling with this. I don't know that any one of them has officially nailed it, certainly in the U.S., but we're actually partnering with cities on this in several locations. And I think it comes down to a few things. The first is pure management and logistics. We know how to test people. A lot of it is about standing up enough facilities, making sure they're coordinated, making sure they've got stuff in order to deliver the volume of tests that we need, obviously keeping our openness to new and faster testing technologies. And when it comes to contact tracing, again, we have history and established pathways for contact tracing. What this is going to require is, one, a lot more of them, and then two, finding the ways that technology can help without betting too big on it. There are certainly ways that there can be iPad-based apps that allow people to be contact tracers more effectively. But I think you're seeing a lot of races among big tech of trying to sort of own the platform and be the contact tracing centered point. And I think it's early to bet on that, but I think using our established pathways to know how to do this, but also ramping them up just from a project management perspective, being able to stand this up. We do know how to do it, but we have to work hard to do it at a large scale, and then from there augmenting with technology where it's appropriate. And we've seen a lot of cities trying to plan through that exact thing, because this is sort of their new phase and the thing they've got to figure out and work on.
That's great. And then just briefly on that idea of PPE, and then some of the other preventative techniques that individuals can use, simply washing one's hands a lot, but when you're out in public, if you have hand sanitizer that you can carry around. Charlie writes in and gives a great website that's helping with some of the logistics and supply chains. getusppe.org/states, another backslash, and that matches PPE needs with producers. And obviously many companies around the country and around the world have retrofitted their manufacturing assembly plants I know this is happening here. I'm based in Detroit. That's happening extensively with automotive companies, but it's happening throughout the country. In Houston, for instance, where companies are starting to uh, create and manufacture some PPE for individuals and hospital use. Additionally, we've seen many distilleries and breweries take some of their stock and use that to create hand sanitizer. So those are some tools that people can avail themselves on. Lara, I want to move on to a major focus that you have had, and we will take more questions as well. But you mentioned this at the top. Climate change has been a major focus for your sustainability office. And you are so proud to have announced, even in the midst of this tragic time, a climate action plan. Can you tell us a little bit more about that climate action plan and how you went about enacting that, and what are some of the plans for that moving forward?
Absolutely. And while I am proud that we were able to release the Houston Climate Action Plan, it was in no way just mine, right? This was a Herculean effort that required everyone from the mayor down to every part of the city. We had stakeholders that were multinational corporations and middle schoolers and everything in between. And a lot of cities already have climate action plans, right? But it takes on a little bit bigger a significance, more meaning in Houston, because we are proudly the energy capital of the world, right? That Houston is inextricably linked to the oil and gas industry. It's part of our history, it's part of our culture. But we are also incredibly vulnerable to climate change. And so over time, you've seen these two pressures kind of coming together, but not meshing, right? That you've got an energy industry and you've got increasing climate risk and increasing communities impacted. And over the past year and a half that we've been working on creating the City of Houston's first climate action plan, you really saw that they finally came together, right? And that was partly because of all of the stakeholder engagement we were doing, but it was also because of events happening all over the world that you saw climate unfold here in Houston. Harvey was one event of many, but that was kind of that moment where Houstonians, something clicked in their mind, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on, that our climate has changed. This has gone far enough. It is not acceptable, and they want to know what they can do personally, what their government is doing, what their business is, what the federal government, what are we doing to make sure that things don't get worse, right? The idea that we can go back, this is our new normal. And so the Climate Action Plan just looks at greenhouse gas emissions within the city limits of the city of Houston and comes up with strategies to try and reduce them, right? Our goal is ambitious in that we are aiming to be carbon neutral by 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement. When we started this, people said, oh my goodness, that's impossible, that's too high. And now people are saying, oh my goodness, that's not high enough or fast enough, right? So we're proud of the result and that it really does fit our community because it was created by the community, right? Houston is a unique city. We are big, but we're not dense like New York, right? We are geographically spread out, similar to LA, but we are in Texas, not in California, right? So our variables, our tools and levers that the city can use are different, but we look to cities all across the country and all across the world to see their best practices, and then went to the community and went to the businesses, sometimes the energy companies here in Houston, and said, how can we do that here? Because we know for any policy in Houston, It won't work if you just copy and paste, right? It's going to be a square peg in a round hole situation. And sometimes we have to like MacGyver it to fit our community, and that's okay, right? So that is what we hope you all will see in the Houston Climate Action Plan. And while it is great that it actually exists, right? This is a fairly historic moment for Houston to come forward and make this commitment. We followed it up 2 weeks later by transitioning the city to 100% renewable energy. That is also really exciting. It is so important that the city step forward and lead by example, but it is so much more important to see businesses in Houston every day making new announcements and commitments of their own, because that's how you show that this is not just a city program, that this is evidence of a larger community and industry-wide change. So I hope you guys go to our website, which is greenhoustontx.gov. Check out the plan, send me email, give us feedback, and stay tuned because we hope to start working on implementation. Again, a plan is only successful if you actually do the things that are in the plan. COVID has brought a slew of challenges to implementation. And I think to bring back that equity question, which is so crucially important. In creating the climate action plan, we saw a challenge. I mean, to me, the biggest gap was it is so difficult to get to the communities that are most impacted by climate change. I mean, it's not for lack of trying, but it was a lack of the appropriate tools and resources to physically get into the communities, because most of what cities do oftentimes is very either media-based or virtual, right? We'll send you an email, check us out on social media, sign up on Facebook, sign up for our e-newsletters, right? Not every community gets its information in that form. Not everyone watches the news or reads the newspaper. Not everyone speaks the same language, right? So there's a lot of gaps that we had identified, and COVID makes it harder to address some of those, right? Our great plans to physically get into those communities are going to have to be retooled a bit, because some of those communities are also the communities that are most impacted by COVID. And so how do we get information and engage them as stakeholders while also socially distancing and making sure that we are not contributing to a larger health crisis?
Quick point of clarification, Laura, and that is congratulations. Obviously, you, your team, the entire city of Houston should be congratulated for your work on this. And thank you for that modesty as well, to point out that it is a team effort. But a quick point of clarification, you mentioned that Houston is now 100% renewable. That's the municipal buildings of Houston, correct?
Correct. So that it just includes municipal buildings, that includes the zoo, that includes the 6,000 structures that are part of municipal operations, 3 airports, wastewater treatment facilities. And so even though it is limited to just city facilities, it's 4% of the total electricity usage in the city of Houston. So just that component is a fairly large chunk when you think about it. Houston's in a deregulated electricity market, so we don't have the ability to control what every single individual and business does in our community. So what we do is we lead by example. We show that if an entity the size of the city of Houston, with 20,000 employees and 6,000 structures, if we can transition to renewable energy and save money, it is estimated to save about $65 million over the lifetime of our contract. And if we can do that, anyone can.
This conversation could go on for a long time, and I just really appreciate everyone's perspective. Before we start to wrap up, though, I do want to talk about the recovery, and I want to bring something from an early question that we had. There's been multiple studies that have looked at how COVID-19 has impacted carbon emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and one study by that Dylan brings up that the nature climate change global daily carbon emissions has seen a 17% reduction during the pandemic. I want to tie that into another question related to recovery, and this is for you, Britt, but then afterwards, Lara, please feel free to chime in. As we think about some of the good things that have happened, there's been a reduction in greenhouse gases. How can we use some green infrastructure to tackle climate change and implement a tool for recovery?
Sure, absolutely. So I mean, those greenhouse gas reductions, some of the new infrastructure, the biking, the walking that we've seen they're very, very exciting. And I think the real question is then going to become, how can we reimagine our communities so that those become our new normal? A lot of those reductions have just come from, no one's driving to work, no one's flying to France. We're getting from some of those limitations that if we don't reimagine our systems, whether it's our energy system, the way we work, we're going to return to normal. And so similarly with the rise of bike lanes, a lot of that is, sort of preparing for people not being comfortable to ride transit. And so it's a little bit of necessity, but I think what we're also starting to see is new ways of working, new ways of thinking about what's possible, new ways of thinking about, what success and, work and joy and community are. And so I think that's really what we're going to be looking for, is how can we maintain that new vision for what we need? And that's going to drive a lot of the specific implementation actions, whether it's, green infrastructure for stormwater or sustainable energy and resiliency or mobility or the intersection of mobility and housing. All of these transitions, I think, Lara, again, congratulations on that plan. That's, I read it, it was wonderful. And we've been through that process. And again, the challenge it really is for implementation, and how can we actually make the things we know we have to make, both within our verticals, whether it's green energy, green mobility, housing location, and then also across them, imagining, a new way of being where all of those are intersected. And so I think that's really what we're looking for, is how to maintain that momentum and become the kind of communities and build the kind of cities that we know we need. We know what they should look like. We just need to do it.
Thank you, Britt. I appreciate that vision. That is very forward-looking. On that topic of vision, Lara, what would your message be to the people of Houston, and Texas, and the United States on how we can build that sustainable future?
I would always point out that, to Britt's point and to your point, the pandemic has given us opportunity to see rapid emission reduction. And so in some ways it's showing what the potential could be like, right? But this is absolutely not the way to go about it, right? That this is not recommended. This could be actually worse, right? If we're not careful how we rebuild, we could increase our emissions coming out of this instead of decrease them. So what we have to do is use this opportunity, look at the data that we're going to gather from 2020 and compare it to 2019 and see what the possibility is. What are the benefits from reducing your emissions? And if we want to hold on to those benefits, that's how we reimagine our cities to still have a thriving economy, to still have trade and people being with their families and traveling, but in a lower carbon way, right? And it's also, how do we institutionalize some of the things that people have found they really enjoy, that they didn't have time to do before, right? We talked about people using sidewalks and parks and biking, and cities all across the country are seeing a rise in people with urban gardens at home. People are wanting to start raising chickens like all kinds of amazing and sustainable ways to live their lives, a little bit more focus on being at home, looking at how if we all can work from home, can telecommute, right? This is going to change our transit, this is going to change our buildings, this is going to change our energy systems, right? So I think I would say it's an opportunity to look at how our systems work and to decide, do we want them to be structured in a way where we can still thrive but have greater health benefits from cleaner air, from less climate risk, and then really work together to try and implement them.
Lara, Britt, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and your work with our audience today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank everyone that took the time to take a little bit of time out of your busy schedule to be a part of this great conversation. We will be putting this program playback up on our website shortly in the next couple of days. So feel free to share that with your friends, your colleagues, and keep this great conversation going. We will do our best to, as a follow-up, to answer some of those other questions that we couldn't unfortunately get to. There were so many great questions, so thank you for sending those in. I want to thank Guidehouse in particular and the City of Houston for helping to present this webinar, and from all of us at Z Prime, thank you for being a part of today's program. In these challenging times, make sure to take care of yourselves and be well. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.